This morning is, as I said before, the last of our brunch talks, but one of the things that's come up is a few questions as we've gone through this. So I have a little bit of a presentation this morning, and then we'll move into more of a conversational style. And hopefully any questions. There's quite a few of you here who have been to almost every one, so I'm really delighted to have so much participation in this. So this morning's talk will begin by looking at what progressive Christianity means to the church and how it relates to the church. And I decided to end on this one because there have been a couple of questions about our own denomination and where we as a progressive congregation fit into the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And one of the things I think is really important is that the last thing that the progressive Christian movement wants to do is create another denomination. So they're not about having congregations leave their denomination, but rather having congregations be salt in a denomination. So we are the ones who are hopefully so salty that we cause some questions in our own denomination. And so as we go along, we'll talk a little bit about this. Continuing with the theme that, progressive Christian religion is open, scholarly, inclusive, that like all religions, it begins in a place of awe and wonder, and that the purpose of the religion is to reconnect us to the mystery, to creation, to one another, and to ourselves. So religion coming from the word to connect, to reconnect ourselves in an effort to achieve wholeness. And the overdriving theology is this understanding that we get from Jesus of Nazareth that God is love. This example of what the character of God is. So this morning, Carol's not going to like it, but here we go. This past spring, Carol and I were blessed to be able to go to the west coast of Ireland. And there's a place on the west coast of Ireland that looks like the surface of the moon. In fact, they did a lot of training for the moonwalks at this particular location. It's a really barren piece of land right out on the seaside, and I wanted you to get a sort of an impression of this volcanic rock. I have no idea how many millions of years old it is. Unlike a lot of tourist sites here in North America, there weren't big signs telling you what things were. You just sort of had to wander around and figure it out yourself. It was an incredibly barren landscape. And knowing that the rocks had been there for millions and millions of years, it was an incredible piece. And it reminded me of another piece that I think we sometimes forget. And this is that at the core of these rocks is their source, the reason that they are there in the first place. And David Steindl-Rast reminds us that religions always start from mysticism. And there's no other way to start a religion. So mysticism is where religions begin. And Steindl-Rast compares the mystical experience to the volcano that gushes forth, and then the magma flows down the sides of the mountain and cools off. And when it reaches the bottom, it's just rocks. And you'd never guess that there was fire in those rocks. So after a couple of hundred years or 2,000 years or more, what was once alive appears dead, just dead rock. And doctrines become doctrinaire, morals become moralistic, rituals become ritualistic. And so what are we supposed to do with it? We have to push through the crust and go to the fire that's within, according to Steindl-Rast. And one of the things that I am always amazed at, this is a piece of volcanic rock, and when it's broken open, there's such beauty inside, such amazing beauty inside. And so sometimes when we're talking about progressive Christianity, and we're talking about being salt, salt can be offensive. And some people can get the wrong impression that what we're trying to do is walk away from the established Christian tradition. And it's quite the contrary. We're trying to bust open the rockiness, the steadfastness, the inability to be movable, to look at the hidden gem that's within. And I think that within the Christian tradition, and most especially within our own Lutheran tradition, there are such treasures that we never want to lose, that we never want to discard. But we don't want to be just immovable rock. We want to be living. We want to be breathing. We want to be an organism that has the ability to change over time. And so when we're talking about being a progressive Christian community, we're not talking about walking away from our Eastern Synod, anything but. We're talking about engaging the church in a conversation that helps us to get back at the hidden core, this fire, this Jesus piece. And so I hope that people don't hear this as a prelude to a separation or a divorce. This is about engaging the church, not walking away from the church. So progressive Christianity then, how does it relate to the church? Well, one of the things that I think that we've gotten rigid about is that we have these sets of doctrines and these sets of beliefs. When I was younger, I thought that in order to be part of the church, I had to believe in a certain, our creeds are laid out. Believe this and you're in. Believe this and you belong. And one of the things that I've learned over the last few decades is that faith is not about a series of beliefs. Faith is about trust. Faith is about walking forward, trusting in community. It's not about a series of beliefs. It's a way of being. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about is the thought of moving beyond organized religion to becoming an organizing religion. This is a line out of a Brian McLaren book. He's trying to get us to be organizing religions, not organized. So already you experience this sort of breaking open, right? Once something becomes an institution, rigidity sets in. And so if we're talking about organizing, what are we organizing for? And I think one of the things that we organize for is so that we can gather together as community, learning together to be love in the world. And I think the thing that we're organizing for, and this is what gives, in old church language, the missional thrust of what it means to be a congregation, we're organizing for justice and the common good. So it's not about organizing solely for our benefit, which I think a lot of us, especially in North America, we have this understanding that we need to go to church so we can get something out of it, that it's for our benefit, that we want to feel good or we want to be strengthened for our week. And yes, it does strengthen us for our week. Yes, it does. We do get good out of it, not always. Sometimes we're there just simply to serve so that others can get good out of it. But I think one of the things that we need to realize is that we're not organizing just for our own benefit. We're organizing for the common good. And Jesus has no interest in creating institutions. Jesus doesn't have a series of beliefs that he asks people to believe in. And Jesus didn't come to create a church. I've come that you might have life and live it abundantly. So these are the kinds of themes that run through progressive Christianity. There's this freedom that comes from setting aside old doctrines like original sin, atonement, and this jealous, vengeful deity who must be placated. But that freedom, it always reminds me of an old song from the 60s. Janis Joplin sang it, I think. Gordon Lightfoot might have written it. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose, right? So freedom can be empty, right? So what are we doing with this freedom from these old doctrines that kept us in this institutional mode? Well, I think that progressive Christianity, if it's going to truly engage the institution, we have to get really, really serious about learning together to be love in the world. And we don't have much time. The reality is the church, the institution, that most of us know and most of us love won't be here in the next generation in its current form. It'll be gone. That's just a reality. And the good news is that we're a people of resurrection. So when this church that we love dies, we get to be part of what is born again, what will be resurrected in its place. And I think that there are kind of a couple of ways to go. People can either be dominated by their fears and become regressive and fundamentalist, or they can become so disillusioned that they just walk away, and it becomes more and more difficult for them to engage in community. Or we can take seriously this call to learn a new way of being in the world. So I'm hoping, obviously, that we will all be part of this new resurrected way of being in the world. And for us, I think we're uniquely placed because we have this example of Jesus of Nazareth. And from where I sit, this new understanding of Jesus that tries to walk away from the old doctrines that, let's face it, were developed by our ancestors who had no understanding that is comparable to our understanding of the realities of creation. Right? They hadn't traveled in space. They haven't even explored the entire planet. They didn't know about what it means to be human. And so looking again at this person, Jesus of Nazareth, to see what can be gleaned, what riches, what jewel lies within these sort of solid rock. So Jesus of Nazareth lived so fully, and you're going to hear Jack Spong in this, right? Jesus of Nazareth lived so fully, loved with such abandon that his contemporaries were able to see the divine in him. And I think that Jesus represents a giant leap forward in our human development. But that's not enough. I mean, if we're going to continue to evolve as humans, we have to take what we can learn from Jesus of Nazareth and continue to evolve as humans and continue to move into more radical forms of love, whole new understandings of what it means to be salty. So where humanity was obsessed with its own survival and individual human beings could not see beyond their own needs, Jesus steps into the human consciousness and embodies a new way of being in the world, a way of loving that enables Jesus to see beyond his own survival, to risk loving so deeply that injustice perpetrated on the least of humanity cannot be ignored, but must be resisted. A way of loving that enables Jesus to have the courage to resist injustice, not with violence, but with love, even if the very act of love might get him killed. And I think those of us who, let's face it, not all of us are activists. And in some ways, it would be easier if Jesus was more of a pacifist. And by that I mean pacifist. Jesus is a pacifist, a peacemaker, a non-violent agitator. And that's a really dangerous thing to be, and it gets him killed. And one of the things I think that we can, when we're trying to figure out what it means to be love in the world and what this new way of being might look like, we look to the life of Jesus to find out what that is. And in Jesus, we see a way of loving that is so tender for those that he loves, that he's willing to give everything for those that he loves. I mean, there's this whole being that is given, and that's what we celebrate in communion. You know, this I'm willing to give everything for you. And I think one of the things that we've lost is this understanding that in communion, when we particularly when we pass the bread to one another, if we see ourselves as Christ in the world, when you hand someone the bread and say, the bread of life given for you, in the same way that Jesus said, here, take this bread, it's like it's my very body, you're saying to the people in your community, here, take this. This is me. This is me, Sylvia. This is me, Pat. This is me, Edward. And I'm prepared to give myself in this community and in this world. And that's a pretty radical way of understanding communion. It's also pretty scary because we live in an individualistic culture that's not designed for us to live in community. In Jesus, we see a way of loving that enabled Jesus not to flee from the wolves that threatened those he loved, but to resist the temptation to seek only his own survival, to step in and stand up to the forces of evil and injustice. Now, I find that really disconcerting. At night, we know the wolves are out there, right? We live in a community where we're being advised to lock our doors for the first time that I know since we've been living there, because there are wolves out there, right? So lock your doors. And so when we lock the door at night, it's like, okay, we're safe in our little home. And we're sort of giving into fear. Now, what would we do if someone knocked on the door and needed our help? I've long since stopped picking up hitchhikers. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we should start picking up hitchhikers. But I hitched oh, my father watches this. Sorry, Dad. I hitched across Canada when I was a teenager. I hitched across the whole country. I hitched across Europe. And people will say it was a different time and a different place, but the statistics say we're actually safer today than we were when I was 17, which was a very long time ago. So we're much safer than we were in the 1970s, and yet nobody hitchhikes and nobody picks up hitchhikers, right? So what does that say about our willingness to reach beyond our own survival instinct? What does that say about how much fear dictates our action? We put up these walls and we put up these barriers, and we do that in the church more often than I care to admit. In Jesus, we see a way of being human that understood the consequences of loving fully and deeply, and trusted that the love itself could not die. So even though it's very, very risky, and Jesus knows the risks of going up against the domination of the Roman Empire, he does it anyway, even though he knows that he's risking his own survival. There's this confidence that the love itself will never die. In Jesus, we see a way of being human that lives on in the love we continue to share with one another. I mean, the fact that we're sitting here around a table still talking about that love is witness to the reality that the love that Jesus embodied will not die. It's still moving us to different places in our lives. Jesus of Nazareth's life and death have the power to call us into a new way of being human, a way of loving that no amount of injustice can destroy, a love that will never die. Now, I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm not trying to convince you that that's a fact. I'm not saying, believe this and you can be a follower of Jesus. What I am saying is, if we have faith in statements like that, if we're willing to live our lives trusting that this way of life can lead us into a new way of being in the world, that's faith. It's not about believing these statements. It's about trusting that there's another way to be in the world. And that's the faith piece. Jesus, I believe, was a giant leap forward in human evolution. And the power of the love which Jesus embodied is, was, and evermore shall be holy, sacred, divine. A love that continues to live in, with, through, and beyond all those who embody the love that Jesus embodied. Where humanity was obsessed with its own survival and individual human beings could not see beyond their own needs, Jesus steps into the human consciousness and embodies a new way of being in the world, a way of loving that enables Jesus to see beyond his own survival, to risk loving so deeply that injustice perpetrated on the least of humanity cannot be ignored, but must be resisted. A way of loving that enables Jesus to have the courage to resist injustice, not with violence, but with love, even if the very act of love might get him killed. So, Jesus of Nazareth's life and death have the power to call us into a new way of being human, a way of loving that no amount of injustice can destroy, a love that will never die. So one of the things that I think we're talking about here in progressive Christianity is recovering the passion, the fire of Jesus. Being love and justice, in the words of Cornel West, justice is what love looks like in public. Organizing for justice, so not just worrying about the organization, not just worrying about the organized religion, the institution, but gathering together and organizing to seek justice, organizing for the common good. In the old days, we called that mission. Unfortunately, the word mission has a really bad taste because Christians have abused our privilege in the world, and we have turned mission into a cudgel. And we need, I think it's one of the words we have to stop using completely, because we've lost the right to use that word. And that needs to be part of our penance. Last week I talked about maybe giving up the word Christ, because it has so much negative baggage in it. So I'm hoping that if we're gathering together to figure out what it means to be love in the 21st century, not in the first century, okay? Not in the first century, but what does it mean to resist systems of domination in the 21st century? What does it mean to organize for the common good in the 21st century? And the overriding message that we get from Jesus of Nazareth is that love is the way. Right? So my question, and these questions are also questions of people in the progressive movement like Brian McLaren, Diana Butler-Bass, Marcus Borg used to ask things like this: can the church become a school of love? Now, right there, we've been talking about this on the internet a little bit, and Daphne, I think it was either you or Laura, said the word love associated with the church this week is not so good, right? Because we have this abuse that's going on. The organization is abusing. There's a legacy of violence. So there may be some work to reclaim that word love that we need to do in our organizing together. But can the church become a school of love? Can the church teach us to be great lovers? What does it really mean? Learning together to be love in the world. I think there's several ways into this. We need to begin by loving ourselves. We need to be able to learn how to better love one another, how to love the world, how to love creation. If we don't learn how to love creation, we have serious problems, not just in the next generation, but in this generation. My granddaughter is sitting here. I have to learn how to organize for the common good when it comes to creation, so that my grandchildren, your grandchildren, our great-grandchildren have a creation in which to thrive. And if the church isn't leading that piece, I don't think we have earned the right to exist. It's the overriding call of our age, is the plight of creation. And we are called to be co-creators. And that means some sort of accountability. And if we are organizing for the common good, then that needs to be part of our priority. And I think once I'm not suggesting that we do these in any particular order. I'm not suggesting that one ranks more important than the other. But I think in learning to love ourselves, one another, the world, and creation, then we are actually loving God, because God is in, with, through, and beyond all of these things. And if we can't learn to love ourselves, we can't learn to love somebody else. If we can't learn to love the world, if we can't learn to love creation, we cannot learn to love God. I mean, and that's really biblical, right? You cannot love the things you have seen. How can you possibly love the things you haven't seen? I mean, the way to love God is not to believe a series of doctrines. You know, the creeds are not the way to loving God. The doctrine of the church is not the way to loving God. The way to loving God is engaging the experience of other humans. And in this tradition, we begin with that human named Jesus. And we look at the way in which he engaged himself, the people around him, the world, creation, and God. And that's where we begin. So, here's a question. It's not my question, it's a question that comes out of a great many progressive Christian leaders. What would happen if churches became schools of love? Anybody?
There would be more acceptance across the board.
Mm-hmm. And I suspect there'd be less acceptance as well. Less acceptance for trashing the planet. Less acceptance for injustice. Less acceptance for the status quo that allows the poor to go hungry. So I think, we're talking about a greater engagement with life itself. The whole thing that Jesus talks about, I have come that you might have life and live it abundantly. So there's an abundance of engagement. Right? Wake up. Right? Be awake. That's one of the things that we hear in the New Testament all the time. Wake up. Our African American sisters and brothers to the south are talking about, living life woke. I love that. Living life woke. You got to be woke, right? You have to be awake. So much of our modern life turns us off. I'm guilty of this. I like nothing better than to go to a quiet corner and put on a screen and distract myself with something other than that. And there's nothing wrong with that from time to time. But we have people who are living lives alienated from their very selves. And it's quite easy to do in the modern world. I don't know how easy it was to do in previous generations. I suspect it was possible because Jesus says so much about it. Wake up. This is your life. This is what you get. Right? Don't be waiting for we're not an elevator religion. It's not about getting you up and out. We're a religion that's about coming in deeper. More engagement with life. That's what abundant life is. More engagement, not less. So I'm going to ask you, I said this was going to be more conversation, what would, just dream a little bit. What would it look like if our primary focus as a community was learning to become the most loving versions of ourselves?
We work so we wouldn't have homelessness.
Okay. It's a really tall order, I need to sleep sometimes, right? I can't be awake all the time. I can't bear to see some of the stuff that's going on around me. The good news is, and I've said this before, when I can't bear to do it, Lawrence is here to do it. And so my job then is to be good and kind and loving to Lawrence, so he can do it. We can't do this on our own. We can only do this in community. Learning to be more loving versions of ourselves also requires that we do love ourselves. And there are days when we just have to go easy on ourselves. The problem is, in our modern culture, we can turn off and be so easy on ourselves that life goes by and we're not engaged, we're not awake.
I wouldn't say it's being easy on ourselves so much as being alienated.
Alienated.
And yeah.
The great Karl Marx. I was avoiding that phrase, but it's true. It's truer today than it probably was in the Industrial Revolution. Being alienated, he was more concerned from the means of production. But yeah, I'm alienated from the means of production. We were talking yesterday about strawberries, and what does it mean to eat fruit that's in season, that's local, right? What does that mean? I'm alienated from the people on the flats that we drove past to come to church, who are picking vegetables in the heat of the afternoon. I can just drive by them. You've done the picking of the fruit, yeah. It's hard work, right? And so our quest for cheaper and cheaper fruit and veg has an impact on who's doing the picking, because people want to drive their wages lower and lower and lower. But we're so alienated from the means of production, from what it means to live in community. The reality is that if you look at the politics of Jesus is a radical socialist. From each according to their means to each according to their needs can be found in the words of Jesus and of the first century Christian community.
The inability to engage our inner selves.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so easy to look on the TV and just get busy with lots of distractions that are so compelling that you don't need to do the work.
And let's face it, walk into a safe building and do liturgy that's safe and familiar and non-challenging and doesn't make us uncomfortable. And we've really perfected that as a community, right? What happens when the liturgy makes us uncomfortable? What happens when we do lament? What happens when, we engage in liturgy that talks about really tough issues? Those things are, I don't know that I want to be that awake on a Sunday morning. Not always.
And for this to be a place where it was safe to ponder that territory that we avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Where you go onto the computer and you can be distracted for hours if you choose, just to play all sorts of interesting things, but not deal with the work you have to do and our, I guess, unarticulated fears, but to be in the company of people who are doing it together and encouraging each other and learning that it's okay to go there and that the rewards are so compelling if you can be helped, I guess, to take that step.
But also, I'm really conscious they call it, what do they call it? Silo communities, right? Are you familiar with this phrase, the silo community? What it basically means is we surround ourselves with people that we like, people that we're comfortable with, and more importantly, people that we agree with politically. The most exaggerated example of that is you only watch Fox News in the United States, nothing else. That's your silo, because those people agree with you. They're not going to challenge your beliefs. In fact, they're going to encourage them. And we roll our eyes at that, but I live in a silo. I really have a hard time with right-wing fundamentalists. So I'm not inviting them to my house to dinner every week, right? There are communities in the States right now, interfaith communities, that are being led by some pretty powerful people. And they're making rules about who can start a new community. You can't start a new community under their umbrella unless you have half a dozen different faiths in that community, unless you have different races. And so if we were to go there, we wouldn't qualify because we're pretty much alike. We would have, and so we said, well, how do people get in under this? Well, they have to start going out and meeting people that they don't know. They need to start inviting people of different cultures into their home for dinner. They need to start engaging people who disagree with them politically. And that's what they're looking at in terms of creating new religious communities. It's about creating a mosaic within smaller communities. That's really breaking out of the silo. Think about your friends, your immediate circle. Do you have any really wild characters in them that are really radically different than you are? I know from my experience, I had more when I was younger than I have now. My tolerance for wildness has kind of become, and yet when you engage with people who are really wild, you see things from a completely different perspective. So what would it mean for us to become the most loving version of ourselves? How do I, as a leader in a community, learn how to love right-wing fundamentalists? I mean, I can love them on an intellectual level and say they have every right to be, and I want them to be healthy. But that's not loving them. I mean, some of us have right-wing people in our families, and we know how challenging it is to love them. How do we make connections? I mean, that's the kind of questions I think it's incumbent upon church communities to begin working through and helping one another to move out of the silos we have created for ourselves, the safe zones we put ourselves in, if we're serious about it. Sharon?
If you take that to its extension, if we're to be working for justice in the world and using our love to create justice and through peaceful means, et cetera, we also then have to be changing the mind of the people who are against it. For instance, let's say the fundamentalists who say it doesn't matter what you do to the world because we're all going to go to heaven anyway, and the world's going to end. So again, we're in mission almost, and that's so. How do we get away from that, the negative connotation of mission, and have a positive view of where we're making the world more loving, as opposed to just saying we're making more people like us?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really crucial is we can't sit down with someone that we disagree with unless we're prepared to be changed ourselves. And that's a really difficult posture to adopt. I struggle with that. I really struggle with that one. And I know I can't do that by myself. I need the encouragement of others to do that. But the other piece of this is, I know I'm a pretty good debater. I have the command of the language. I used to be, as a young person, I was on the debating team. I won all kinds of awards for I can go head to head with any fundamentalist, and I can tie rings around them. And that's not going to do any good whatsoever. The way that I'm going to get to change them is to be in relationship with them, and for them to see that well, for starters, I'm a lesbian. And while they may believe that, I'm of the devil, if we develop a relationship, it becomes harder for them to discount me. And so those kinds of changes aren't going to, we're not talking about going, presto, we're going to flick a switch and we're going to change people's minds.
I understand that.
We're talking about loving relationships, which change it. So my ability to really truly love a right-wing fundamentalist is going to be severely challenged, and I might be changed by something in that relationship.
Okay, so, and I'm saying from their perspective, let's say they're coming from the same place that we're coming from, except it's up the right-wing side, and they're saying, I'm going to be more loving in the world by convincing all these people who think that there's no heaven and no hell, that there really is. Mm-hmm. So are you just not ending up going like this?
Yeah, you are going to end up going like that. But it depends.
So how does that change from where we are now?
Because where we are now, we're not even engaging people like that. How many of you, when you're confronted by racism or hatred, just either turn off the switch or walk away. I've heard people say, oh, when we get together for dinner, we just don't talk politics. We're not engaging now. I don't think we are. Now, the way in which we engage is going to be really, really hard. And I think we need help with that. I certainly don't, I'm not getting in the car and driving down a few blocks to the south to a congregation that thinks I'm of the devil and prays for my immortal soul. But I might go there if you guys come with me. You know, it's a different way of relating to one another in an engaging way. Yeah, I'm going over here to Daphne and then Edward.
And Lawrence.
And Lawrence?
I don't know how this fits in, but I was at my mother's retirement home, and they had a church service there. And I was, going through the church service, and it was obviously very, very far to the right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sitting there feeling, pretty smug about this, I know a lot more about that. And then the thought came to my mind, it's not our church that's sitting doing that service for the old folks.
Yeah.
It's their church. And why are they doing that? It's based on love.
Mm-hmm.
So I always get a little uncomfortable, and I have lots of relatives who are right-wing Christian people. I always get a little upset or a little queasy when there's a negative about the far right. But what Amberetta said to me one time is, that's fine, but when it hurts people, that's when it has to
So
stop.
it comes back to Greta Vosper's statement, it does not matter what you believe, only how you live.
We're
And
talking
if you
about
live
living.
in love with other people, that is your actions, not your words. That's it.
Yeah, and I think the hard part is that we know we're right. We just know we're right. And our focus becomes on convincing you of the truth because we know we're right. Rather, it becomes, how did you become who you are? I'm genuinely curious about how you took this route. Because if in terms of the way in which we are in the world, we have an understanding that fear has played a huge role in the way in which we choose particular beliefs or doctrines or how to live our lives, then part of being loving is finding out what that person's afraid of. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of me? Are you afraid of losing your security? And 9 times out of 10, when I'm really brave enough to do that, I discover that they're afraid of a lot of the same things I'm afraid of. And that's a place to start. Now, I'm not suggesting I want a steady diet of people who disagree with me. That's hard work. But I think that's why we come together in community, and I think it gets dangerous when we're not challenging one another. I love that you don't agree with everything I say. I love that about this community. I would probably be saying, oh, it's time for me to move on if they all believe what I'm telling them. It's time to move on because we've stopped trusting enough to say, no, that can't be true. But we have different levels of engagements with people that we're in deep relationship with and people that we're just meeting on the street, right? And so how do we respond to them in a loving way but say, no, as for me and mine, we're not going to do that because someone could get hurt, Or how do we say lovingly? I find I get it from children. How many have been shamed by a child in the last week about recycling? It changes who you are. It just changes who we are. And children have a better way of doing this. I remember when we were kids, it was, trying to convince our parents not to smoke. And we shamed them. Most of the people who quit smoking, a lot of them, it had to do with children in their lives, right? So I think if we stop engaging, if we stop having difficult conversations with people we disagree with, then they get to stay in their silo and I get to stay in my silo, and there's no real relationship. And that's difficult. But I think if our motivation is to change them into us, that's not going to work either. If our focus is to create a more loving environment for everyone, if that's our focus, and if we remember that we may not have all the answers to how that can be, and the way that we get to remember that is conversations like this, right?
There's an overlay as well for me that I spent years in the funding world before this. And so for me, looking back now, that had wonderful things in it, but there are elements that were truly toxic. And so when I meet people in the midst of it, my thrust is to hear them and let them know that I respect their journey and where it is, and then to gently share that for me, it ended up having irreconcilable problems, that I no longer can live there, but I understand where they're coming from because it fit me like a glove for a while, not realizing some of the other costs that were playing alongside.
I'm going to sort of be a little unfair here, Andrew, because I think one of the things that you have done for me in this community is you've held up a mirror to me every once in a while that's really annoyed me. And Andrew does it with a gentle question. It's a gentle question. Like, I'll be off on a tangent somewhere, and Andrew will ask me a gentle question, and I'll go, oh, and kind of my lip curls, right? It's like, oh, yeah, I really sound like what I don't want to become. Right? It's just a little, and I don't know if you're always aware that that's what you're doing. I suspect you are because you're a really good teacher. But I think that there are, and that's what we get to. That's what I'm talking about: being community and supporting one another in this really tough way of becoming more loving versions of ourselves. And I think the word "becoming" is important because we're not arriving; we're becoming. Edward is next, and then back to Daphne. Edward.
It takes a lot of energy to engage with some of those people.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if our energy is not better spent like engaging with organizations that are sort of on our wavelength and in that sense sort of grow their capacity to influence. Then
I think the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. But that's not the whole answer. I think we need to do that, and we need to go where we're uncomfortable. But not everybody is good at it. So within a community, we have people who are better at it. Let's send Andrew to do that on our behalf, because Andrew has that strength. Let's send you because you have the passion for particular justice issues, right? That's why we have our global justice team. They have a real emphasis on that. People who are really worried about the folks who are on the street. We have wonderful people who go to the outreach van once a week, and they're doing because this feels more tangible to me. So I think when we do this as a single individual, we get overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. When we do this as community, we strategize, look around, what are our strengths? What are our strengths in this place? We're not going to change the world bit, by small acts. That's how it gets changed, right? And so there's a sense of not being overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, saying, this piece we can do. This piece we're going to do. And when we get a little too comfortable with that piece, pushing ourselves to see if we can do more, or something that really frightens us, right? And my nanny was fond of saying, she would push us. When we were kids, we loved scary stories. We loved scaring ourselves, and no one liked that better than my nanny. And Nanny would push us into a room that we were afraid to go into, and she'd push us and she'd go, "Follow me, I'm right behind you." It was like, I'm not going in there, you go in there, right? And sometimes that's how we do it, right? We get around and we've got your back. You go in, we're scared. You go in, we're right behind you, I think the benefit of community is that I don't have to do it all by myself, and if the community is really engaged, they're going to challenge me out of my sleepy state and wake me up to stuff that I really didn't want to know about in myself, in the people around me, in the world, in creation, and in my relationship with the love that we call God. Like, to be pushed in that way by community, I think, is crucial. And I think one of the things that we've done with saying that individual religion, I need to be born again, I need to be saved, it's all about me. And we're talking about a different way of relating that remembers that we are all one. Daphne, you were...
Oh, well, some of the things you just said, now I'm thinking, if I had a little more help at that point, it would have been different. A few years ago, when I took one of my grandsons on a trip, and we were out we went from British Columbia to Calgary, and we met another couple who were from South Carolina. Very nice. And we had breakfast and dinner with them a few times, and of course Jack was only 11, so we loved, the four of us. Beautiful people, beautiful people. Turned out that he was one of the pastors of this fundamentalist church in South Carolina. But we, really nice, caring people. And they'd never been to Canada before, and they said, oh, Canada's lovely. So I said, well, yeah, I love Canada and the multiculturalism. And I said, I work for a company that we have over 60 different cultures, nationalities, religions. And I said, I have Muslims that are friends of mine. And they said, Muslims? You know Muslims? I can remember this as if it was yesterday. And I just said, yes, I do. But I did not have the courage to say, why do you feel so negative about this? I didn't want to participate in that kind of conversation. If I learn some techniques or ways to do it now in the future, if that happens again, then maybe I will say, well, why don't you like Muslims?
Yeah.
They're a lot of wonderful people.
Yeah, and I also think learning from other people about how they do it, how they engage others, has always been really helpful to me, to learn from somebody else who's doing this. I also think we need to learn to be a little kinder to ourselves. This is hard, difficult work. Carol will tell you this, sometimes when we're traveling in places that aren't quite as welcoming of who we are, I'm the one who's saying, shh, just be quiet. And she's the one storming up and going, and this is my wife. And I'm like, no, I don't want to, don't say that, because I'm afraid, right? And I'm afraid that I can't protect Carol, I can't protect myself, and she's the brave one. And that pulls me into being a little braver, because, well, Carol did it, so now I have to do it. It's like, if I had to do it by myself, I would just stay in my little silo, where it's safe. But we also have to go easy on ourselves sometimes, too. Sometimes we just need to engage at a level that we are comfortable with, because it isn't always safe. But we also have to be prepared to cross over into unsafe territory. Yes, Lawrence?
Just sort of what you've been saying and what Anne was coming up with. I often find when I get into that difficult situation is to ask questions.
Yeah. Why?
Ask lots of questions. Like, you find it uncomfortable being with Muslims? And then have them try to explain. Yeah. And sometimes they'll come, when it's political, sometimes they shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah.
Just by asking questions.
So can I push you a little farther? The sometimes they'll shoot themselves in the foot part. The debater in me goes, they did that, I made them say so much. Yeah, Daphne, precisely. 1 point for me, 1 point for them. And the hard part for me personally is to get to the place where I'm really seriously developing some kind of empathy for what they're afraid of. How do I get to the place of empathy? And for me, I need to learn that from other people. One of the best things I learned when I was in seminary was when someone says something that you're just like, what the? Is to say, and all you want to do in your whole being is like, defeat them and say, no, that you're wrong because you're an idiot, you're an imbecile, you don't know about this, you don't know about that. And that's how I was raised. In our family, we had debates around the supper table, and you had to win the debate. But I think the most valuable thing I learned in seminary was to say, tell me more, even though it's the last thing I want to hear. Sometimes I would say, kind of, can you say more about that? I don't really understand what you're getting at. And sometimes they will talk themselves into a place where they've shot themselves in the foot because they're suddenly in the presence of someone who isn't either fighting with them and saying you're wrong, or someone who's agreeing with them. It's someone who's saying, tell me more. I need to learn more about that. And they have to learn how to articulate what they are saying. Sometimes it works and they become more gentle. Not always. And sometimes I just can't be bothered. It's like, and I just wipe them. I wipe their humanity off. I'm not interested. I'm going to put you in your silo, and I'm going to close the door, and I'm going to walk back to mine.
But sometimes when you do that and you ask them, I had a professor that when you went to him, he would always just say, why? Why? And eventually I think he thought, and it was true, that if there was a fallacy involved, that the person saying it would eventually hear themselves actually saying it and come to the realization, and so it was like self-teaching, really, or redirecting in a constructive way without being confrontational.
I love the stuff that comes to us from our Jewish ancestors, this notion of pilpul.
Yeah.
So someone asks you a question and you go, I don't know the answer to that. So you ask them a question back, and then they ask you another question, and then another question, and another question. And in the bouncing back and forth of the questions, something is revealed that neither of you expected. It's how these conversations go in the basically in a yeshiva, in a Jewish seminary. That's how they're gonna discover something more about the divine in the back and forth questions. Nobody's answering any of those questions. But one question is provoking, another question is provoking, another question is provoking, another question. And suddenly you go, oh yeah. Sylvia.
Well, I was just thinking through the course of these last few comments. Maybe this community is in a unique position to benefit from that. Because we're older. When I was younger, I had more passion. When I'm older, I have more patience. So I'm probably more able to sit and listen and ask questions than I would have 25 or 30 years ago. So
Yeah.
I think the timing was better this way.
I recognize the wisdom in that, in myself also. However, I want to be patiently passionate. I don't want to just become a patient person. Impatience. There's Carter Hayward, a wonderful feminist theologian, talks about the power of anger in the work of love. There are times when you say, "It shall not be so among us," because that can hurt somebody. That's not loving. Or I can't go there with you because you're hurting people. Or sometimes you have to step in between someone and the pain that's being inflicted on them. And that's really difficult to do. I think about domestic abuse. You experience it and you're like, I know it's happening across the street, What is my role in this? Well, let's close the windows. Let's just close the windows and we can't hear them anymore. That's one response. Or they'll work it out themselves. They don't really need me, or maybe I've got it wrong. There's the denial of it. What would it take for us to walk across the street and knock on the door and say, everybody okay? I'm not sure I have that kind of courage. But what you're saying is, how do we teach one another those skills? If our like-mindedness is about learning to be more loving versions of ourselves, if that's the thing that holds us together as a community, then how do we teach one another? I love this. There are so many educators of different varieties and kinds, both professional and amateur educators in this community. How do we teach one another to be more loving versions of ourselves? Now, If someone can help me with I have a little toolbox, and you have other things in your toolbox, like if you could teach me what's in yours, or if we come up to a problem that we don't know what to do about, or we just puzzle it through together. Yeah, Pat?
But listening to the conversation, I have several different people in my life where I consider them right wing, notably neighbor Bill. But you're familiar with.
I like that you still said neighbor. That's cool.
Yes, well,
That's cool.
yes. But I've learned how to continue to be in good relationship with him and his wife, who they listen to talk radio all the time, and when we're cutting the grass, I hear them with the radio as we're working together. And so I was just curious to know, because I do live in my silo, I understand that he's who he is, I am who I am, and never the twain will meet. Even if I factually ask him why he believes a political belief, in the face of facts, he will continue to go down another road. And so I tire of that. And in order to remain in good relationship, we just don't talk about our political beliefs. And yet he's Catholic, I'm Protestant. And we can talk about some of those things, but he's right-wing in his Catholicism and so on. I just find it easier to retreat into my silo, leave him in his.
Yep.
Because if you talk facts or ask him questions, as people have suggested, he's never going to, or maybe I'm not. I don't know.
Well, you can agree to disagree.
Yeah.
You
I disagree to
can,
agree
and
to
that is
disagree.
easy. What you just said, it's easier to just let him stay in his silo and I'll stay in mine. It is easier. My question is it love? There was a horrible country song years and years ago when I was a kid growing up. I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. You know, like we have this really namby-pamby view of what love is. It's hard, it's tough, it's unpleasant, and it means putting us, I mean, I'm sure Jesus didn't want to go to Jerusalem because he knew the Romans were there. And it would have been easier to stay home, and he could have stayed with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and created a community there on the outskirts of Jerusalem, stayed out of the way of the Romans, and not engaged. That's not the way that we are called to be in the world. Maybe from time to time, like he did go there to Bethany and just stay there and rest and recharge his batteries. And then he went on to Jerusalem. And maybe you're not called to deal with neighbor Bill, right? But I see you doing this in the wider church all the time. It's strategizing. You know, we all strategize. Edward.
I let them usually go up to a point, and there is some, and it depends on each individual. I mean, if it's like an older person and they have some conservative view, I maybe give some more room. But there is a certain point where I say, okay, that's the line for me. That's where it stops. Now I gotta say something.
Yeah.
So, and I did this with individual people, but I also did this with the people with mental disabilities I work with, because some of them, they were for years brought up in their family home, and some were very conservative. And then we were told that we should just let it go by, whatever they say. But even, and they are smart, they understand, and I let it go up to a certain point, and then I said, no, this not like this, you know.
Yeah.
When it comes to racism or exclusionism, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just you have to wager with every person on your relationship with them and how well you know them, how far you can go.
Yeah.
But I always usually draw a line, and sometimes if it's a guy at work, he's a nice guy, but I don't engage much politically with him because he's hardline conservative, and no, I just think it's no point. He's not changing his opinion. So,
Yeah.
but if it were that he, for excluding other people, then I would say something.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to move towards is recognizing that our language is going to fail us. Now, I use terms like right-wing fundamentalist to make a point in this particular silo. There are places I would never use that, right? It's just not going to get us anywhere. And I think labels like conservative and liberal. I mean, I remember my first month at seminary. I said I'm a radical, conservative, Christian, feminist. When people would say, "Well, what kind of Lutheran are you?" I was like, "I'm a radical, conservative, Christian, feminist," and they would go, "How can you be a feminist and a conservative?" Well, a conservative is someone who wants to preserve things. I wanted to preserve the traditional liturgy. And that's where I saw myself as a conservative. Right? Politically, talking to our son yesterday, it was like the other night we were solving all the problems of the world. Yes, there was scotch involved. And we were solving the problems of the world. And he's conservative. He would describe himself as a conservative, and I'm not. But he thinks I'm a liberal, so I'm his arch enemy because I'm a liberal. And he's saying, "You're not a liberal." I said, No. I said, not even the NDP is far enough to the left for me. I'm a Christian socialist, right? So suddenly the labels that he's put on me, the dress he wants me to wear, doesn't work anymore. He's the most tender-hearted guy. He's not the conservatives that annoy me, right? You know, but he's conservative. So I think these labels will fail us each and every time. We sometimes have to use them for the sake of communicating and to make points. But I think that it's incumbent upon us to put a lot of those labels away. And one of them is maybe that label Christian is still problematic for some folks. Maybe that label Christ is still problematic, and maybe that's our repentance piece. Maybe the repentance comes from the word metanoia, which means to change your mind, to change your way of being in the world. And so how do I change my way of being in the world? How do I change my way of relating to this person? Where can I find the kindness, the goodness in this person, and how do I speak to that kindness? What if churches became schools of love? What if our whole priority in congregations was not to teach a whole bunch of beliefs, not to ritualize a whole bunch of doctrines or dogmas, but to sit around with one another and figure out how to become the most loving versions of ourselves? Marnie, our song is "I Dream of a Church."